So today's webinar is titled Aphids, Scales, Mealybugs, Oh My, and it is presented by Karey Windbiel-Rojas, who, as I said, is the Associate Director for Urban and Community IPM, and also an Area Urban IPM Advisor for Yolo, Solano, and Sacramento counties. As the Associate Director, Karey provides leadership and coordinates communication and educational efforts to address urban pest issues around homes, structures, landscapes, gardens, schools, and public areas. I'll now hand it over to you, Karey.
Great, thank you. As I get my presentation up here. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to have so many people joining us today. So I do have a lot that I want to cover today, and I'm already seeing questions coming in through the chat, so we'll get to as much as we can. There are a lot of insects in this kind of presentation and in this category that we're going to cover today. So what we are talking about today are what we refer to as honeydew producers. Honeydew producers are some of the small, soft-bodied insects that we normally find on plants in a variety of different settings, whether it's in the vegetable garden, in the landscape, on fruit trees, on ornamental street trees. So these honey producers, they're called that because they do secrete a honeydew substance, which I'll talk about in a moment. But many of these are familiar to a lot of gardeners. And so the honeydew producers include aphids, which is what is pictured on this slide, as well as certain scale insects that belong in the soft scale group, mealybugs, psyllids, whiteflies, and some species of leafhoppers. So today we'll cover some of those in a very general sense and managing them and some resources. And I know that there'll be a lot of questions. We'll do what we can, but these resources will be shared on where you can find more information. So first, what are honeydew producers? So there's the list that I mentioned, but honeydew producers are small, soft-bodied insects that have a mouth part that is like a tube or like a syringe, and they stick this very thin mouth part into the plant and they suck out plant juices, plant sap, we might sometimes call it. It's the phloem. And so they suck the plant juices out, and what they excrete as their waste product is what we refer to as honeydew. So the honeydew is liquid, it has water, but it also has some of the sugars from the plant. And so it is a sweet, sticky substance, but it can get all over the plant and cause unsightly damage or sticky damage. And we'll talk about that as we go along today too. And so here you can see just this drawing of the mouth part and the honeydew. Right here, what's pictured in the bottom left are mealybugs, and in the bottom right are whiteflies. And I'm going to go over each one of those groups today. There are various signs that you have a honeydew producing insect on a plant. You can find curled leaves. So as these honeydew producers feed on plant material with their mouth parts, they are small insects, and so their mouth parts are also very thin. And they tend to feed on the newly growing leaves, not always just on the newly growing leaves. Sometimes it's on, sturdier leaves. But when they feed on the newly growing leaves, it might cause those leaves to curl. So some of the signs that you have a honeydew producing insect is that you have curled leaves on certain plants. Because of their feeding, they might cause the leaves to turn yellow. Some of these also will, excuse me, carry viruses, and the viruses can cause the plant leaves to turn yellow as well. The feeding on the leaves may cause the plant, especially if it's a young plant, to not grow as well and normally as expected. And so a plant could be stunted. There's also a sticky, shiny look on the plants, which is what you can see in this bottom picture. And that is all actually the honeydew, what is excreted. And so it'll be on the surface of the plant. And so the leaves might look wet or sticky, or you see them from afar and they're shiny and you wonder what's going on. What also grows on top of the honeydew is what's pictured in the top corner here, is what is called sooty mold. This black sooty mold is a fungus that isn't attacking the plant necessarily. It's growing there as an opportunistic fungus that is growing because the sooty mold is there. And but it can be unsightly as well. You also might find, with the presence of a honeydew producing insect, that you have ants going up the tree. The ants, as I'll talk more about today, the ants are harvesting the honeydew and using that as a food source for their colony. And I mentioned the viruses already. So when you see large numbers of ants going up a tree or a bush or around an area where you have plant material, the presence of the ants are a potential indicator that you have a honeydew producing insect infestation. The ants feed on the honeydew, but the ants that you find are the worker ants, and they take the honeydew and they carry it back to their nest, back to the colony. So the ants are there with a job to gather the food and take it to the nest. So they are there protecting and gathering their food source. And because they want to protect this food source, they may also fight off any predators or parasites that would help us control the honeydew producers. And I will give you some more specifics on what predators and parasites you might see out there to help us with our infestation battle. So you want to not only know about the honeydew producers and do what you can to control their numbers, to manage them, you may also, if ants are present, need to do some additional insect management by reducing the ants there too. And so all of this I will talk about throughout the course of today. So first, let's talk about the insects themselves and understand a little bit more about some of the honeydew producers. So first, we have aphids. I think most people are familiar with aphids, but if you're not, they are small, sort of pear-shaped insects. They feed on the underside of leaves. They can be found when there's a large infestation on the surface, the top surface of a leaf, but they're also found sometimes on the flowers, in the flowers, in new growth. They can be found in galls on plants. Pretty much, all over a plant, you may find aphids, depending on the level of infestation. There are many different colors and many different species of aphids. So here you can see oleander aphids are this really bright yellow, and they have black legs and black little protrusions. The black cherry aphid are black, and their nymphs are a little lighter color. And then these are green peach aphids. But there's pink aphids, there's light yellow aphids, there's green aphids, there's a big variety of colors. Aphids don't move very quickly, and the next slide I'll talk about the life cycle. And they usually occur in dense groups, so they feed together. So here is a picture of these are oleander aphids, and the way the aphid life cycle is that you've got a summer generation where you might have many generations within that season, and then you have your winter cycle. So aphids are insects that go through the incomplete or the gradual metamorphosis. So they don't have a larval stage, they have the nymph stage. The nymphs look a lot like the adults. And the majority of the aphids you'll see are not winged. So there is a stage in their life cycle where they are winged, and you can see a winged aphid here in the picture, in the upper part of this picture. And so they will develop wings during certain times of their life cycle, and then they will travel, but mostly you're going to see them without wings. Females also give live birth, so you're not going to see the egg stage of aphids, and so they give live birth, and the juvenile, the young aphids look just like the adult aphids, just without really the size and not too much differences in their features. And so you can have multiple generations of aphids within one season. I also want to point out on this picture, all the white parts here, those are the shed skins as aphids go through their various stages of growth called instars. They shed their exoskeleton. And so you may see signs that aphids were there, or you wonder what the white parts are, and that's just their shed outer exoskeleton. And then these yellow ones are the live aphids. So aphids have a lot of different plant hosts, and some species can transmit diseases to their hosts. And so they can transmit diseases from, this host to that host. And some of the vegetables and ornamentals that can have viruses are listed here: squash, cucumber, pumpkin, melons, some of the beans, potatoes, lettuce. These can have viruses that are transmitted by aphids. Aphids tend to be very plant specific in what host they feed on. And a lot of insects are named by their host plant. So this one here is the woolly apple aphid. They're called woolly because all of these little filaments here that look like cotton is part of their body. They have a very woolly sort of body, and they feed on apple. So woolly apple aphids. And then the picture at the bottom, ash leaf curl aphids. So they feed on ash plants and they curl leaves. And so a lot of times their names are going to be very specific. And there's many, many more. And I'm not going to be able to go through all the different aphids, but I am going to show you at the end where you can find resources to find specific information on some of the aphid pests. But they sometimes an aphid species will have an alternate host. A lot of alternate hosts for aphids and other insects might be something that we consider a weed. So right now there's a lot of weeds out there because of the rain we've had. And we find a lot of aphids on weeds like sow thistle or some of the grasses, some of the weedy grasses. And then those might move over to one of our crops or ornamental plants. So in general, that's aphids. Now I'm going to move on quickly because we have a short amount of time today on soft scales. Soft scales are insects, and they are often not thought of as insects. People might think that they are a growth or a gall or a disease on a plant, but these soft scales are, they're insects. They are wingless and legless. And the females have this sort of hump shaped, and in the adult stage, they don't move. So they will get to where they go as juveniles. And the juvenile stage is called the crawlers. I'll show you a life cycle in the next slide. The crawlers do have legs. They'll walk over to the part of the plant where they will start to feed. They will put their mouth parts into the plant. They lose their legs, and then their bodies develop right there on the spot to develop this hump-like kind of shell. And then they don't move at all. They just continue to feed there. They have piercing and sucking mouth parts, just like the aphids, where they pierce their mouth into the plant and suck out the plant juices. And you can find them on leaves, on branches, sometimes on stems. And there are a great number of scale insects. There are different categories called armored scales and soft scales, and then other kinds of scales. So they don't all produce honeydew. Some of the other scales don't produce honeydew at all, and so they're not in the category that we're talking about today. But so I mentioned the crawlers. So you will have your mature females that have that hump shape and no legs and no wings. And they will produce either by mating, or sometimes certain insects don't mate at all. They're all female and they just develop eggs and develop their progeny without the presence of males. Male scale insects do have wings at certain times of their life cycle, but in general, the females will produce their eggs, and their eggs are underneath that shell body. When the eggs are mature and ready to hatch, they will hatch out as the crawlers. The crawlers will go out to the parts of the plant, and here's a picture of the crawler stage, and they're really small. But they will either crawl, or sometimes the wind will blow them from parts of the plant to other parts of the plant, or from place to place, plant to plant. They will find the place on the plant that they are going to feed. They lose their legs, and then they go through their growth stage instars, and then they become those hump-shaped insects that we find. So there are many different hosts for soft scales as well. They can be on indoor plants, they can be on outdoor plants. They feed on the foliage in the nymphal stage, usually on the softer parts of the plant, and then move to the bark. And so here you can see some scale insects in various life stages. We have the really young scales, and then the more mature scales here on the midrib. Sometimes there's a huge infestation of scales all vying for the same place. And this is the tulip tree scale, also named for its host. Brown soft scales have a pretty wide host range, but some scales only like to feed on certain plants. And so some are host specific, some are not. And just because there is a scale infestation on a plant doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be very damaging to that plant. It really depends. And so, again, we have information on the UCIPM website that I will share towards the end, or my colleagues will be sharing it in the chat as we go along today. But as Lauren said, we will send you links and information to our website in a follow-up email tomorrow. So you can not be distracted by the chat and everything else. You can just stay and listen, and this will be recorded for you too. So next we're going to talk about mealybugs. Mealybugs are white and roundish, kind of oval shaped, and they are covered in a waxy substance. So you can see the pictures here of a mealybug infestation on this plant and a close-up of a mealybug. They tend to feed in protected hidden areas. There are some mealybugs that feed right at the root or at the crown of a plant. And so sometimes you don't see them until you notice some of the other signs of their presence, like curled leaves or stunted growth or honeydew or whatnot. So, but sometimes you do see, especially if there's an infestation like the top picture showing, you may see them. There are mealybugs on a number of different outdoor plants and also indoor plants, but just like the aphids and the scale insects, mealybugs are host specific as well, with some species enjoying different hosts, a variety of hosts, but others only preferring one type of host plant. So in the mealybug life cycle, their females are wingless, but the males have 2 wings and 2 long tail filaments. The newly hatched mealybug nymphs are also called crawlers, and they are sometimes orangish to pinkish. There's a variation in color in mealybugs as well for different species. And the nymphs are mobile, right? They're crawlers, they do crawl. The adults are not. And so they may live on a plant for just one season, but they may also overwinter, or if you want to think of that as hibernating, they can overwinter on or under the bark of plants. And then when the weather is nicer, they will come out and feed. So there's a lot of variation in mealybugs as well. And we'll point you to the resource to learn more about them and find information on specific species. So as mentioned, the hosts of mealybugs will vary. There are specific mealybugs that like specific hosts. So here's just 3 common mealybugs we may encounter in the garden and landscape. The obscure mealybug likes many different kinds of outdoor plants. The vine mealybug prefers grapes, and again, it's named for its favorite host. But they do go to other fruits and some ornamentals as well. And then we have the citrus mealybug that is found on citrus, but it also goes to some other hosts, namely certain landscape shrubs and some indoor plants as well. So it's important often to know what kind of plant you have, and then that will help you narrow down the type of pest you have, whether it's a specific kind of mealybug or aphid, or even a different pest altogether. Moving on to whiteflies. Whiteflies are tiny, soft-bodied insects that tend to have yellowish bodies and more white wings. These showing here are 3 different kinds of whiteflies. There's the greenhouse whitefly that's often in the greenhouse, but it can be on other things. Giant whitefly, which is giant relative to whiteflies. It is itself not a huge insect, but it's a large size whitefly. And then silverleaf whiteflies. And so these are host specific as well. They prefer to feed on the underside of leaves, so you may not see them right away. And when you rustle the plants or disturb them somehow, you may find like this plume of flying insects that you weren't expecting. And it almost looks like a dust, but you see them flying away. So that's how whiteflies go. The life cycle is similar to the others we've talked about already, where the female lays eggs. So these don't give live birth like aphids do. They lay their eggs, and the eggs hatch out into crawlers. Here is the nymphal stage. These guys that kind of look like mealybugs, but they're a bit more translucent. And so they're in the crawler stage, and they can have these filaments that get longer as they develop, and you can identify them to species in the nymphal stage as well. And then they will develop into the adult stage, where they will fly or crawl, because they do have functioning legs and wings. And so you can see both the filaments of this banded wing whitefly, and then the nymphal stage without the filaments on the sweet potato whitefly. So in just the last 2 slides, there's 5 different kinds of whiteflies that I mentioned. There are many different species of whiteflies, and they have their specific host plants that they will go to. So some of those hosts for greenhouse whitefly, giant whitefly, and sweet potato whitefly, they like specific vegetables, certain landscape plants, and some house plants. So it's important to know what plant you have, and that will help you narrow down the specific pest on it. And there are other whiteflies here too. The crown whitefly, which is pictured at the top here, these are the nymphal stage. They're very interesting looking, but again, easy to distinguish from others. They go to oak and chestnut trees, whereas the citrus whitefly likes citrus, but also ash, ficus, and pomegranate, and others. So here are the adult citrus whitefly on a persimmon leaf. Moving quickly on to the next group of honeydew producing insects, we have the psyllids. And just like with the others, there are lots of species of psyllids. Psyllids resemble cicadas. So if this picture, the bottom picture, was a life-size picture, that's how a cicada might look. But the psyllids are really small. They're about the size of an aphid as well. But they have these really big wings that are translucent, and they hold their wings like a roof-like over their bodies. But again, they're small. They do jump and fly when disturbed, and there are many different species, but generally they don't cause a lot of harm to plants. But there are certain psyllid species that we are really looking out for, because they can cause a lot of damage. So there are many different species, as the slide says, 18 of the 140 psyllid species in California. Some are native and some are introduced. Some cause harm and some don't do a whole lot. So they develop through 5 instars, that nymphal growth stage, before maturing into the winged adults. Both the males and the females of psyllids have wings, which is different from the scales and the aphids and the mealybugs. The nymphs are flattened, as you can see here with the Asian citrus psyllid nymphs and the acacia psyllid, and also the red gum lerp psyllid. The nymphs are flat, they don't have wings. They're less active than the adults because they can only crawl, or they might not be very mobile, and they can't fly because they don't have wings. Some psyllids produce their honeydew is more like a wax. So the Asian citrus psyllid, they produce these waxy filaments. So this is their waste product, but it's a really good way to be able to identify them is by seeing these waxy filaments, because you may not notice the insect actually on the plant. What you're going to see, just like with the sticky liquid honeydew, is you might see these waxy filaments. The red gum lerp psyllid, they create this waxy cover that the nymphs are underneath. So in this picture, you can see this is an adult psyllid right here where I'm circling. And then all the little covers that are called lerps are the waxy covering. If you lift them up, like this one right here has been lifted up, and right here you can see the nymph underneath, which looks kind of like this guy, just a different color. And so different species will produce these different either waxy material or a more sticky type of honeydew. Psyllids, like many other insects, are going to be most abundant in the spring. And depending on the species, they'll have a certain number of generations each year, which is how many offspring they have in one season. Just like the other ones we've talked about, psyllids have many different hosts, and some of them can transmit viruses and diseases. One psyllid in particular that we are really keeping our eye out for and concerned about in California is the Asian citrus psyllid, or ACP. You've probably heard about it already, and if not, great, here we are. The Asian citrus psyllid is, again, a small insect. Here is an adult Asian citrus psyllid. They feed on the plant with those piercing and sucking mouth parts like all the other insects we're talking about today, but they can transmit a disease called Wang Long Bing, or citrus greening disease, and it's a bacterium. So they can transfer this on their mouth parts from plant to plant. What's the problem with Wang Long Bing, or HLB disease, is that the disease doesn't currently have a cure, and it can kill the plant within 5 years. And California has a large citrus industry, so we certainly don't want this little insect to transport the disease and ruin our backyard trees and our economy. So we're keeping our eye out for Asian citrus psyllid. There's a huge statewide campaign and program to make sure that people know about them. And we will share resources with you at the end of the talk today and through the email tomorrow for you to find out more information and what to do about it. The red gum lerp psyllid host, I showed you on the last slide, those lerps, those are really just on certain species of eucalyptus, and those psyllids are not going to go to a different host. Those are also considered invasive pests, but they're pretty widespread in California already. And then another interesting psyllid is the Eugenia psyllid that only attacks Eugenia, and therefore it's named for its host. And that's what's shown here. And they make these little pits on the leaves. So lots of different signs that can help you determine which psyllid or which pest you have on whatever host plant it favors. So now we're going to talk about management. And the management of these honeydew producers is very general and very similar. Because they are soft-bodied insects, a lot of the management tactics can be the same. So we're going to talk about integrated pest management. Integrated pest management, as you may know, is an integration or a combination of different practices or strategies to control the pest. Usually there's not going to be one golden way, one method that you do this and then you won't have any of these pests on your plant for the season. Unfortunately, you have to come out at these pests with a variety of tactics that IPM. But integrated pest management allows us to find different ways to control these pests without needing to turn to a chemical or pesticides. And that's going to be better for the environment, for our health, for our pets, for our children, and for the non-target organisms. So IPM relies on an approach that involves biological control, what we call cultural controls, mechanical controls, and if needed, chemical control when it's necessary. And this provides us for longer term. And so I'm going to talk about each one of these very, very generally. But for any of the honeydew producers, you want to be on the lookout for them. Inspect your plants, look for those signs that we talked about at the very beginning. And usually they're going to be more abundant in the spring and when there's new growth on the plants. So you can focus your attention to where there's new growth or where you know that this is a host plant and you typically see aphids this year or whatever. You want to keep an eye on the ants. So if the ants are going up a tree or into a bush, it's very likely they've found a food source, which may be one of these honeydew producers. And so you want to think about how to manage the ants as well as the honeydew producer. And then, of course, good signs to help you monitor are the honeydew and or sooty mold. So what's showing here are some sticky cards. You can put out sticky cards that will help you monitor the population. Maybe at the beginning of the season, you see a few whiteflies, and as time goes on and the weather's nice, insects are flying, you might see more. And at that point, you will determine what you want to do about that pest problem. So things that you can do to prevent some of the honeydew producers from accessing your plant is to remove their alternate host. I mentioned earlier that some of these species will have an alternate host, and a lot of times that host is a weed. So remove weeds before you plant the plants you want to grow so that you don't have this ready source of a pest. You want to check any transplants that you're going to put into the ground, check them for pests, and see if you can get rid of some of them before you put them in the ground and don't notice the increase in the population. You can grow your seedlings and transplants and young plants under a cover. So you can easily find these floating row covers, and you can put up, some sort of structure that keeps the cover from sitting on the plant itself. You can do kind of a hoop house. You can, construct it however works for you. But putting a row cover will keep some of the flying insects from being able to get to your plants, especially when they are young and just starting to develop. And then you can use those sticky traps that I just showed to catch pests and to help you monitor for what you have and also the level of infestation, and help you make decisions to do some management before the population gets really high. There's also a mulch that you can find. It's a little harder to find, sometimes hard to install in your raised bed, depending on how you've designed your raised bed. But it is a reflective mulch. It's made of aluminum, but it's not just putting aluminum foil out there. So if you can find this reflective mulch, which you can find online, some stores carry it, the reflective mulch will confuse the flying insects. It shines the light back up onto them and they can't find the plant as easily. So this helps repel some of the flying pests. You can also choose plants that are not big hosts to certain insects or even diseases. So you can plant plants that are not susceptible to these pests by choosing through various gardening books and websites. Talk to your local master gardeners about good plants to grow. Certain species of or cultivars of fruit trees or other landscape plants are less susceptible or even resistant to specific pests. A lot of California native plants are better able to tolerate some of these pests, or they just may not be a good host to them. So your plant choice is an important tactic for reducing pest numbers. You want to care for your plants properly as well. So make sure that your plants are getting all the water that they need, not too much, not enough. If you over fertilize, you could be causing a lot of the lush new growth, and that lush new growth is very attractive to some of these piercing and sucking honeydew producing insects. So fertilize as much as your plant needs, but not over fertilizing. And then if you do find pests, you can just prune off the shoots or the leaves or twigs that have the pest congregation, and that will reduce the amount of pest pressure that's on the plants. And if you find that you need to hose them off, which I haven't talked about yet, or other things, pruning out some of the infestation will be less of a population that you have to deal with. And then if you have a plant that's constantly getting pest problems, or the infestation gets so bad that the plant looks ugly or it's stunted, or you don't want to deal with it anymore, you can always take that plant out. There's no shame in that. You can take the plant out and you can plant something else, something that is more tolerant or resistant to pests in general, that also looks nice, or whatever it is that you want to do with that plant. So that is always an option of just starting over, right? So there are a lot of beneficial insects and organisms that we call natural enemies that will be naturally occurring and will help do some of our pest control for us. There are so many different species and varieties of these beneficial organisms, these natural enemies, that feed on or parasitize other insects, and especially the honeydew producers. There are predators like this syrphid fly larva. Syrphid flies are also called flower flies or hover flies, and their larvae look like caterpillars, but they're not. They're flies. So they will eat some of the soft-bodied insects. They especially love aphids. So if you see something that kind of looks like a caterpillar on your plant, wait and see what it's doing. Maybe it's hanging out with the aphids, and you see it gobble up one, and you then know it's not a caterpillar, it's actually a beneficial. Lady beetles or ladybugs, the adults will eat soft-bodied insects, and many species of lady beetles, like aphids, their larvae also like aphids. So ladybugs or lady beetles are fine. They are technically beetles, and their larvae don't resemble the adult stage. So if you don't know what a lady beetle larva looks like, learn to recognize it, because they are out there eating lots of whatever their favorite food is. Many species like aphids, but other species of lady beetles eat other things like mealybugs or scales. It's sometimes very specific. And then there are parasites that will lay their eggs into a host, and then the parasite develops within that host, ending up killing it. And they do that very frequently. So you might see signs of parasitism. So this is a hole in a scale insect, and this is a hole in an aphid where a parasite used to reside, and it killed that pest and helped us do some biological control. So we do have information in our YouTube channel, and also past webinars on biological control. And we do have one coming up later this year on good bugs and biological control too. So even though I'm going fast, there's a lot of information that we do have to help you recognize these. One other important and common predator are lacewings. Lacewing adults you've probably seen before on around your porch lights or other lights. They eat soft-bodied insects, but so do their larvae. And again, their larvae don't resemble the adults. And then you may have seen their eggs, which are in this top picture. So they feed on a lot of these soft-bodied, honeydew-producing insects. I mentioned lady beetles already, and the variety of lady beetles. So here's just some of the lady beetles that you might encounter. They're different species sometimes. and they might have their favorite food may differ. So they don't all eat aphids. Some eat scales, some eat whiteflies, etc. And they are predators, but they may be specialized. And learn to recognize their various life stages. They go through the egg, the larva, they pupate, and then they become adults. Syrphid flies, I mentioned the one, it looks like a caterpillar. So this is what the adult looks like. They look a little bit like bees. They have that bee mimicry, but they're actually flies. And the adults feed on pollen and nectar, whereas the larvae feed on soft-bodied insects. And so learn to recognize those and look around your yard to see if where you might have one of these pests, you may also have the predators or the parasites. So I mentioned parasites and I don't have time to really get into it, but the parasites are these parasitic wasps or flies that lay their eggs into an aphid, and then they end up killing the aphid or scale or mealybug. They do attack lots of different ones. They lay their egg inside, and then the wasp goes through its life cycle, and then it emerges out as an adult. So what that looks like on the plant is where you might see aphids or scales, if they're a different color or they are sort of blown up, they may actually have been parasitized. So we want to recognize these natural enemies and also not harm them by spraying pesticides. So there's a lot of resources that we have to help you on the UCIPM website. We have the Natural Enemies Gallery that you can sort the list by what pest is what you have and what natural enemy attacks it. And so we have this list for both predators and parasites. So we will be sharing with you the link to the Natural Enemies Gallery where you can go look around and learn how to recognize these as well as recognize the pest. So managing ants, I did talk about, and so very briefly, try to keep the ants out of your plants. The ants will fight with the beneficial predators and parasites. And so if you keep the ants away from their food source, they will eventually need to move their whole colony, because the ants that you see, those are the workers, their job is to collect the food. And if they can't do their job, they have to move. And so you can manage the honeydew producers, but also do things to manage the ants, such as putting out bait stations or using a sticky substance to keep them from going up the trees. And without time to get really into all of that, we do have other videos and webinars about managing ants where we cover that topic. And so there's lots of different controls, mechanical and cultural controls. We talked about plant care as a way to manage honeydew producers, but you can also use the hose to spray them off of really sturdy plants. And so roses, just take the hose and squirt them off. You can prune them out, as I already mentioned. You can hand pick or scrape off some of these, but that's a little tedious. Maybe the tree's really tall and you can't get to it. So how you go to control some of these pests may depend on how large the tree or shrub is, or maybe hosing off a tender seedling is going to actually damage the seedling. So you have to take some of these control measures specific to what plant you're dealing with and make those considerations. But you can also just tolerate low numbers of pests. We don't have to have our rose bushes or our trees be 100% plant or pest free, right? The plants can usually tolerate a low number of pests on it. So, if you have a huge infestation and a lot of sticky honeydew, or you find that the plant is really suffering from it, then you can implement one of these control tactics. But in some cases, a couple aphids on your plant is not going to kill it. So if you have a large infestation or you need to turn to a pesticide, we want to make sure that you're using these pesticides properly and choosing a material that's going to be less toxic to the environment, that has fewer risks to people, pets, water quality. And so choosing the right pesticide to get to the pest A lot of times the pesticides will not control pests that are curled up in leaves or in galls. And so making sure that the pesticide you choose is going to actually contact the pest. And so reading labels is important, and choosing the right material, which again will be found in the UCIPM resources that we will share with you. So very briefly, because we do want to have time for questions, there are many different kinds of pesticidal or insecticidal soaps and oils. These are formulated for use on plants against pests. We are not at all talking about using dish soap or kitchen type of oils to spray on your plants. Those are not designed for use on plants, and you can actually harm your plant or harm the environment by using some of these home remedies. So dish soap, no matter how natural it is designed to wash dishes. It is not designed to spray on your plants or use outdoors. So these that we're talking about here are designed as pesticides. They're labeled as pesticides, and they have different ingredients. Some are derived from plants, so like neem oil or peppermint oils or horticultural oil, which is usually made from a petroleum product, which is natural. Some of the insecticidal soaps, they're made of fatty acid chains. And so many of them are considered less toxic, and they're also organically acceptable. But they work by smothering or suffocating the pest. And for these soft-bodied insects, they work really well. You need to spray them so that the material comes in contact with the pest. And so timing and also how you apply it is really important. If the whiteflies or the scales are on the underside of the leaf, if you spray the top of the leaf, it's not going to contact them. It's not going to do anything. So you need to make sure that the material is contacting the pest for it to work. And these soaps and oils, they dissipate. They don't stay on the plant forever. So putting out a spray when the pest is not there is also not going to do very much because they are lesser toxic. They don't have that long persistence in the environment, which is actually good. But you also want to make sure that you are not applying pesticides on a stressed plant or when it's very hot outside, above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, because you can damage the plant that way too. There are systemic pesticides. We really want to share that they can be used, they can be effective, they go through the whole system of the plant, but they should be used only when the infestation of a pest is very severe, that it's very damaging, or maybe it's a big, really large tree where you can't get good coverage from the contact insecticides. And so the systemic insecticides are absorbed by the roots of the plant and translocated throughout the plant. And in order for the material to be moved through the plant, you have to have good enough water to move the material through the plant. And it may take several weeks before the material does get moved to the different parts of the plant. And usually the application is good for a whole season. But there are issues with this systemic insecticides. They belong mostly in the neonicotinoid group. They can disrupt those beneficial insects, and they can also harm bees and other pollinators. So while they are available, try some of the other IPM tactics before turning straight to a systemic insecticide. And again, we do have information on our website to help you in making your decision. You always want to read the pesticide label. It gives you the information on what pests that it's going to control and other considerations like is it toxic to bees or water bodies. And this one in particular that's shown says do not use on food crops. That's really important information. So always follow the label, read the label, and wear protective clothing that's going to protect yourself. So this is my last slide before resources, but monitor, look for your pests and the levels of infestation. And you want to see if you can tolerate low numbers, but there's a lot of non-chemical controls, but you have to identify your pest properly first before you turn to any kind of control measures, and then only use pesticides if you find it necessary, and when you do, less toxic materials. So for more information, we have the UC IPM website that contains thousands of pages on hundreds of insects and other pests. And so if you scan the QR code, that will take you to our website, or the URL is there. We'll also email it to you tomorrow. And you can also find help on specific pests and identification from your local University of California Master Gardener program. They can help with identification and finding solutions. And so look them up either on that URL or in your online searches. But if you go to our website, you'll go to the home, garden, turf, and landscape pest pages, where you can find information on how to narrow down your pest problem by plant type or by insect or other pest type. So lots of information there that will take you to one of our final pages. This is our pest note on mealybugs that goes through identification, life cycle, damage management, and goes through all the different solutions. And then we have other information as well. So all of that's on our website for free. And thank you very much.